We're here with two very special guests, Craig Mokhiber and Annelle Sheline. Both our speakers made the choice to reject the comfort of conformity and instead to use their expertise and their moral authority to publicly and visibly oppose the destruction and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. We're honored today to be able to have such a special opportunity here in Buffalo to hear directly from Craig Mokhiber and Annelle Sheline on the topic of what we're calling human rights in the Israel exception. As we awoke today to more horrific and unspeakable images from Gaza, as we read new reports of aid workers being massacred and dumped in a mass grave, and as dissidents against crimes like these get pulled off U.S. streets by masked agents under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism, Craig Mokhiber is an international human rights lawyer and activist and a former senior United Nations human rights official. He served more than 3 decades at the United Nations with postings in Switzerland, Palestine, Afghanistan, and the UN headquarters in New York, where he was the director in the New York office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. During his time at the UN, he undertook dozens of human rights missions to countries across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. In late October 2023, Craig left the United Nations, publishing a widely read letter criticizing the UN's human rights failure in the Middle East and warning of unfolding genocide in Gaza. His letter called for a new approach to Palestine and Israel based on international law, human rights, and equality. And as many of you know, Craig has been an extremely visible and public figure denouncing Israel's assault on Gaza and defending the human rights of Palestinians. In being here in Buffalo, we should also note that Craig is a graduate of Buff State and UB Law and a proud native of Niagara Falls. Annelle Sheline was visiting Buffalo for a conference and was so generous to join us here tonight after we reached out, and we are extremely thankful. Annelle served as Foreign Affairs Office at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor's Office of Near Eastern Affairs. That's a mouthful. Before resigning in March 2024 in protest over the Biden administration's unconditional support for Israeli military operations in Gaza. She was very public in her resignation, appearing on multiple media outlets and writing a widely read CNN op-ed. She's a senior non-resident fellow at the Arab Center of Washington, D.C., a non-resident fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, and an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University. And she's also currently a research fellow in the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So thank you both for being here. Nice. And thank you both for your principled and courageous stands. So I guess to start, I was wondering if both of you could talk a little bit about your decisions to resign from your positions at the UN, Craig, and at the State Department, Annelle, over the siege of Gaza. These were very public and consequential decisions that you made, and I'm wondering if you could explain for a few minutes what led you to make those decisions. Maybe, can I pass it on to you first, Craig?
Sure. Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Annelle. Thanks to JVP and CPC and MPAC and the Western New York Peace Center and everybody who came out today to participate in this conversation. I hate this part of talking about me and what I did in all of this, but I think there are elements of it that are important for people who are engaged in the movement to put an end to this kind of atrocity and the support that it gets from, in particular, the West, and especially the government of the United States of America. Because my struggle with the UN, I was at the UN for 32 years. I had been in the international human rights movement for more than 40 years. And at my time in the UN, I witnessed a kind of trajectory in the policy of the organization that was going in a very negative direction. And I blamed it on the Oslo period. If you look at the way the UN was looking at the situation in Israel and Palestine prior to that, it very much was, up until the early 1990s, a position that was based on international human rights, international law, notions of equality, decolonization, all of those things that you think of when you think of the normative core of the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, self-determination, all of those principles. But something in the organization broke very fundamentally with the advent of Oslo. The message inside the UN with Oslo was, stop all this human rights stuff, stop talking about international law. This is something to be negotiated in a political process that may or may not lead to a two-state solution somewhere down the road. And Oslo was a ruse. It was a trick that was played between the government of Israel, successive governments of Israel, successive governments of the United States, and with the support of the United Kingdom and other Western powers, that pushed the rights of the Palestinian people all the way back to the back burner and replaced them with this amorphous political process, where all of a sudden Palestinians were told that they had to negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, with their occupier, and with a mediator of the process that was the closest ally of their oppressor and their occupier, meaning the United States of America. And predictably, that led to a downward cycle in the human rights of the Palestinian people over a period of decades. And by the time 2023 had arrived, the situation was such that Palestinians had no human rights of any kind anywhere in the occupied territories or beyond. You will know that the Palestinians are persecuted in the diaspora, including right here in the United States, not only in the occupied territories and inside of Israel. And the UN had become weaker and weaker in responding to this horrific web of atrocities. Now, I want to say, since I'm criticizing the UN, there are two UNs. There's one UN, which is the political side of the house, which is the Secretary General, the senior political officials, the intergovernmental bodies. They lost the plot a long time ago. They surrendered the rights of the Palestinian people to other interests. There is another side of the UN, which is the independent human rights mechanisms, Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, the Commission of Inquiry, indeed, the Commission of Inquiry headed by Navi Pillay, the independent treaty bodies, the other special rapporteurs who have maintained year after year, decade after decade, a principled human rights-based approach to the situation in Palestine. But the political side of the house had sold out a long time ago. And they did it mostly out of fear. And what were they afraid of? They were afraid of the government of the United States, not afraid of the Israeli government, afraid of the government of the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, other Western powers that would démarche them if the UN ever dared to take a strong stand on the human rights of the Palestinian people, something that I confronted many times in my career. Well, this got supercharged in 2023 with the assumption of an openly fascist government in Israel, where Kahanists, followers of Jabotinsky, really dyed-in-the-wool, racist, violent, fascistic forces were now in the government in Israel. And we saw from the very beginning of 2023 that what was unraveling was genocide. We didn't discover it in October. Now, needless to say, the history of Palestine has been a history of genocide. 1947, 1948 were genocidal assaults on the Palestinian people. But with a tacit agreement of the West, what had happened for decades between then and now was that they had moved to a kind of incremental genocide. Yes, there were thousands of political prisoners of Palestinians. Yes, houses were being demolished. Yes, settlements were being expanded. Yes, periodic military assaults on Gaza and on the West Bank were taking place, torture, summary executions, all of that. But they always kept it at a simmer. In 2023, it spiked, not in October, but beginning early and then really in the spring of 2023. And I was speaking out publicly about the human rights situation in Palestine as a senior UN human rights official. That was my job. And I had done it for dozens of countries all around the world without any interference. Well, at that moment, a coalition of Israel proxy organizations organized a campaign against me and began to attack me publicly. I'm actually very proud of this because they put together a team to research everything I had ever said publicly from the 1980s until that moment in 2023, trying to find some anti-Semitic comment that I may have made, and they couldn't find a single anti-Semitic utterance. So, of course not, because I have always been and will always be in solidarity with my Jewish sisters and brothers, just as I'm in solidarity with all of my sisters and brothers in this struggle and beyond. But what they did was they just created a compilation of every critique I had ever lodged against the state of Israel for its human rights violations, and they said, see, he picks on Israel, so you never heard this before, but apparently if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. So I know no one has ever heard that before, but yeah, that's it. Well, and then they began a campaign which they got the government of Israel to démarche the UN against me. They got the government of the United States to démarche the UN against me, and they created a massive pressure. And I thought to myself, well, I've been through this 100 times before. No one has ever silenced me. Then the order came down from above that I was to be silent in the face of an unraveling genocide in Palestine. And I said, what, silent on what? I said, is this all 195 countries that are on my portfolio, or only this one country? No, only this one country. And you are not allowed to say anything publicly that the Secretary General or the High Commissioner have not already said. And I said, this can't be real, you know? But what had happened is they had become so fearful of, you know, it's a meaningful fear because, you know, when the budget committee comes around and the UN Human Rights Office has to go there and say, you know, we need money for our anti-racism program or our migrant rights program or, you know, our economic and social rights program, we're going to remember this. And so there was an attempt to silence me, and I could not be silenced, and so I continued to speak. And then in October, when the full-scale massacres began in Gaza in particular, and by the way, I should say, in the spring of 2023, we had already seen an upsurge in massive atrocities in the West Bank, not in Gaza, in the West Bank, where there was wholesale ethnic cleansing going on, pogroms in Palestinian villages like Hawara, an upsurge in political prisoners, reports of torture and abuse of every horrible kind. And that was in the spring. And so, of course, I was speaking out about that. By the way, I have spoken out against, you name it, you know, at least 150 countries during my career. No one in the UN has ever told me to shut up. It's only in this case, and that was something I couldn't swallow. So in October, when it became very clear, when you had the senior-most political leaders and military leaders of Israel stating their genocidal intent out loud, and following up those acts with genocidal acts on the ground, I said it was time to ring the alarm bell and say this is happening, and that's when I published that letter. And I think it was the best move that I ever made. I think if they were trying to silence me, they made a mistake because without the constraints of the diplomatic protocols of the UN, I feel like I've been anything but silent. So I'm glad.
It's a real honor to get to be here to speak with you all. And I mean, as we're kind of sitting in this space facing this political moment, you know, this, as was mentioned, I was here yesterday to speak on the rights, you know, the issue of human rights in the context of Israel-Palestine, and we acknowledged the fact that it may be increasingly difficult to have those kinds of, you know, meetings. It was at UB, it was public, and wondering about even spaces like this in the context of, you know, the sanctuary of a church where ostensibly we have the right to be here and to gather. But I just want to acknowledge all of you for being here as things are feeling different than they did a year ago when I resigned. And I was mentioning, you know, I felt very privileged having spent time in the Middle East. You know, I studied the Middle East. Privileged as an American to feel that I could speak out against my government and feel pretty sure the Biden administration was not going to come knocking on my door in the middle of the night. And these days It's really hard to say. I would have to think harder about that. So just really want to acknowledge all of the work of all of you here that have been doing this work, and Craig, and also just I think, so thinking of like someone like Craig who resigned and spoke out so early, or someone like Josh Paul who resigned so early from the State Department. At the time when October 7th happened, I had only been at the State Department for about 6 months. I have an academic background. I'd been working at a think tank. I owed the government a year, which is how I was able to kind of be hired at the State Department. And I had few illusions about what it would, working for the US government. The think tank where I work and had worked previously is very critical of US foreign policy. I have had few illusions about the role of human rights in US foreign policy decision making. But when the Human Rights Office reached out, said, we'd like to bring you on board, we see you have this service commitment, I thought, well, all right, I criticize it all the time. Let's go see what it's like on the inside. And again, I had few illusions, but it was quite interesting to work on human rights under an administration which had said they were going to put human rights at the center of their foreign policy. And it was just so obvious, again, before October 7th, that was absolutely not the center of anyone's thinking. I mean, even just physically, kind of, the State Department is this, very large building in Foggy Bottom in downtown DC, and where our office was, the Human Rights in the Middle East office was in kind of a separate annex. And so if we wanted to go meet with the desk officers or meet with representatives, human rights defenders who'd come from the region, that would all be in HST, like in the main building. After October 7th, when it became clear very quickly what US policy was going to be, and you had people like Josh and Craig giving up these long careers to speak out publicly, I think from my perspective initially, I thought, well, I'm on the inside. This is what they talk about. Try and make a difference from where you are. Within the State Department, you have the opportunity to write a dissent cable. So I co-authored a dissent cable. I signed other dissent cables. And it just became clear that even people several ladders up the rung of hierarchy inside state were also opposed to what was happening, and yet that was having no impact whatsoever. And so I decided I was going to resign, but I wasn't planning to do it publicly because I had been there such a short time, and I really didn't think anyone would care. And it was colleagues inside state who said, please do this publicly. And then and my husband kind of laughed at me at the time. He's like, well, no one's going to care. I'm like, well, at least I'll know that I spoke out. And then it did. And I think a large part of, why it got so much attention was because at that point, when we think about like a year ago, the uncommitted movement was getting some attention. It seemed like maybe that was having an impact. I think so many Americans were really sort of like, what is going on? Like, how is this still happening, and how are we still supporting it? When I did go public and did get more attention, I think my hope was that maybe some more senior people would also resign after me. And that, Hala Rarit, who was the Arabic language spokesperson, who was certainly more senior at the State Department than I was. People like Stacy Gilbert, who resigned over the 620I report that was falsified, that she had worked on the real report, which said, yes, Israel is blocking humanitarian aid, therefore they're no longer, they were already not eligible to receive US security assistance, but now really. But so many other people that didn't speak out against it. So again, I just thinking about kind of how horrible things seemed a year ago and how much more horrible they are now. Again, just really want to commend all of you for waking up every day and facing this, because I think it is easy to turn away.
Thank you. So, you're both experts in your respective fields. Craig, longtime human rights official with the UN, and Annelle, as a member of the State Department, engaged in U.S. foreign policy. And I was wondering, I know this is something you could talk about for a long time, but I was wondering if you could just talk for a few minutes about your analysis of Israel's assault on Gaza and the West Bank, for that matter, on Palestine, and from your positions of expertise, and so what do you think is really important for people to know about what is widely understood by many as an ongoing genocide?
I mean, it's almost non-controversial now, and it's amazing to me that a year ago it seemed controversial in so many circles here in the United States in particular. But what I was saying in October of 2023 is that you will never see such a quintessential manifestation of genocide as we are witnessing now in Palestine. I had been at the UN through several genocides, and I had witnessed the international community's failures in every one of those genocides, one after another. But there was something very particular about this genocide. And I've said this before, but it really is very striking that normally when you are looking for accountability in a genocide, you have to dig through dusty government archives to find, some document that reveals the intent. Because genocide is not just these horrific, atrocious acts, but those acts have to be committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a particular group as such. And we had never seen before this clear manifestation of intent, because what had happened, thanks to the government of the United States, the United Kingdom, and some others, the culture of government in Israel is a culture of impunity. There was 100% confidence on the part of the prime minister, the president, the senior military commanders, the cabinet members, that they will not be held accountable no matter what they do. And because of that, you had one after another. There's a database which is probably in excess now of 1,000 genocidal statements by Israeli leaders, which has been compiled. And it was already in the hundreds by the fall of 2023. We all know the famous speech by Benjamin Netanyahu, the indicted prime minister of Israel, and his Amalek reference when he commanded his soldiers to go out and do what happened with regard to Amalek. And you know the quote from the Bible about genocide, about basically destroying everything and everybody, including men and women and children and suckling babies and livestock and so on. In other words, absolute genocide. And so it was with the public statements of course, these were all in Hebrew. In English, on CNN and in all the other complicit Western media corporations, they said something else. They used magic words, terrorism, right, Hamas, and so on, like that justifies genocide, right? But when speaking to Israelis, and in particular to the military and to people in the government, they said very directly what their intentions were, and those intentions were clearly genocidal. Cutting off all food and medicine and water and electricity, not to Hamas, but to the people of Palestine. And, so when you have a case like that, where the statement of intent is so clearly made over and over and over again, and then repeated by the military commanders on the ground over and over again, and then carried out with genocidal fury on the women and children and men and journalists and aid workers and everybody on the ground, and you were afraid to use the word genocide, you have failed in your responsibility. Not just as an international official or a government official, but as a human being in the end. So that was what was so striking about this. And, today, Israel is on trial for genocide in the International Court of Justice. Its leaders are the subject of arrest warrants for crimes against humanity, including extermination, by the International Criminal Court elsewhere in The Hague. It has been found to be guilty of the crime against humanity of apartheid by the International Court of Justice. The International Court has ruled that the entire occupation is entirely unlawful and needs to end immediately, which means every settler, every settlement, every soldier, every Israeli bicycle anywhere in the occupied territories is unlawful, is a violation of international law, and needs to end. Every major international human rights organization, Israeli human rights organization, Palestinian human rights organization, has declared that what's happening here is indeed genocide. And it is not contained only to Gaza. It is in all of Palestine. We have seen, the massacres, the ethnic cleansing, the purges, the torture, the beatings, the mutilations, the sexual assault, all of this perpetrated against the Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem. It includes the persecution of Palestinians who live inside the Green Line in what is now Israel. And it includes the persecution of Palestinians and their defenders here in the United States and in Germany and in the United Kingdom. This is all a part of the genocide. And everything we do to raise awareness, to push against this, to hold people accountable in this country is a part of the struggle against genocide there. And I'll tell you, bright light, because this is all so somber. It hasn't all been dark. The beautiful solidarity, the mobilization, the courageous public actions of Jewish Voice for Peace. Of Jewish and Christian and Muslim and agnostic and atheist and Buddhist and progressives and people of all walks of life who have been standing up. And remember, standing up, you witnessed this under the Biden administration and under the Trump administration. You witnessed it in the US and in the UK and in other European countries. You're doing so at the risk of being smeared as a supporter of terrorism or an anti-Semite. You're doing it at the risk of being attacked and beaten by thugs. You're doing it at the risk of being beaten or arrested by the police. And you're doing it at the risk of being fired or expelled from school. You're doing it at the risk of, you name it, of breaches in families and so on. And yet, people have been standing up since October of 2023. The numbers have grown every single month continuously as the time has gone on. The protests have gotten louder. People refuse to be silent. And that's what will make the difference.
Hear, hear. And again, that's just testament to all of you. And I it's interesting for me as someone who's based in DC and kind of within the DC bubble, and to get out of that space and come here again, where, and I realized what I said, what I ended with, like, that it's kind of easy to turn away. Obviously, it's not, and for many people who've been so directly affected, you can't turn away. But I kind of understand the impulse of the people who would rather do that. And so again, like, to just recognize the strength that it takes to keep showing up on this. And in terms of thinking about analyses of Israel's assault, it was really interesting during yesterday's symposium to get to hear from people who've studied this and have much greater expertise than my own, to focus on things like sort of the starkness of international law on the question of Palestine. That was Mohammed Fadel from University of Toronto was speaking on that. Nader Hashemi, who's from Georgetown, was speaking about sort of this question of why does this conflict resonate so much around the world? And his answer for that was that it's the brightest and clearest example of ongoing colonialism, and so resonates so deeply in the global South. From my perspective, and this is informed by where I work at the Quincy Institute, which is deeply critical of US militarism across the world, and in my talk yesterday, just spoke a lot about the influence of the defense industry, of the military-industrial complex, and the irony that human rights are supposed to be tied to weapon sales in the law. And while I was working for the Human Rights Office, a huge part of what we did was work on the human rights reports which were originally signed into law in the mid-1970s in the aftermath of Vietnam and, well, in the aftermath of Nixon and Ford, to try to require that the United States think about human rights when it sells weapons. And the human rights reports have never been used for that purpose. And as I was working on them, that was never brought up. It was never sort of acknowledged that that was the original purpose of these reports. It was only afterwards and sort of learning more about the history of all that. I think in terms of understanding this conflict, and that this was also something that Michael Barnett said yesterday, who was another speaker, that he doesn't necessarily think there's a single answer to understand what's been going on, and we're meaning-making creatures, and we're trying to make meaning of this senseless horror. And I recognize that impulse in him as an academic, but I also sometimes, I get really tired of when people say, well, this whole situation is so complicated. And I'm often like, well, it is, but also, how complicated is it really? To go back to just sort of the military-industrial complex, the influence of the Israel lobby, the weapons industry, I had the opportunity recently to meet Cori Bush, the member of Congress who was primaried by millions of dollars from AIPAC, as was Jamal Bowman before her, as well as people like Josh Paul and Tariq Habash, who founded a new policy to try to push against, to the idea being that it's not actually in U.S. interests very frequently to have our foreign policy aligned so directly with the interest, not actually of Israel, but with Netanyahu and with his government. And so that they're doing what they can to try and lobby and push for kind of a rethinking of U.S. foreign policy on this. And yet, until we get something fundamental like campaign finance reform, I don't think we're ever going to see much change on this question, on general American militarism, on so much of what we're seeing in Washington and across the country right now. To conclude in terms of how to understand this genocide, I mean, we'll have to see years from now, looking back on this period, where it is that we're looking back from. But just acknowledging Zionism as the tip of the spear for the death of American democracy is, in some ways, not surprising, but I hope that's not the case. But we'll have to check in a few decades.
I had two more questions, but I want to sort of merge them into one so that people here have enough time to interact and ask questions with our guests here. I was wondering if you could comment on what you see in terms of either continuity or a break or between 15 months of the Biden administration supporting and arming this genocide, and now a couple months of the Trump administration. And then I guess maybe you could also just comment on what you're seeing specifically at this moment. What's your analysis of what's going on right now with Israel's breaking of the ceasefire, renewed atrocities? What's your analysis of the situation now? Do you want to go first?
Sure. It's only a little bit there, so
right.
Well, first of all, this is a bipartisan disease in the United States. Clearly, remember that none of this started with Donald Trump. Donald Trump just put a new vulgar spin on an already ugly series of policies. There is a difference, which I'll talk about, but Trump was in office. He did a number of unlawful things, including recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights, moving the embassy to occupied territory in Jerusalem, investing in this charade of the Abraham Accords, kicking out the Palestinian ambassador. I don't know, there's a whole list of things that Trump did in his first terms. Joe Biden undid none of those. He continued those policies in place. He declared over and over again, I am a Zionist, and he participated in a genocide. He armed it. He provided intelligence for it. He provided diplomatic cover. He provided 4 vetoes to stop just a ceasefire even. So he participated, and I used to talk about complicity, which is a specific crime in the Genocide Convention. But the United States government has gone beyond complicity. It is perpetrating genocide in Palestine. It's at that level. Then Trump got back into office, and he, without any of the theater of the Biden administration about pretending to have humanitarian concern, and we told the Israelis they better respect international law, and building a fake pier that then blew away in the first rainstorm, and still refusing to allow the food to flow in as famine was growing, still blocking medicine, still arming the murder of babies over and over again. I was never, ever impressed by what I called humanitarian fig leaves by the Biden administration that continue to commit these crimes and then pretend that they cared about humanitarian law. Trump just says it right out loud. I am going to kick out the Palestinians and colonize Gaza in order to build. I mean, he just says out loud what anyway the Republicans are doing. And I mean, honestly, if Americans are still walking around somewhere in this country thinking they have a democracy, you have got to be incredibly naive to believe that is the case. This is a plutocracy. It's an oligarchy. There is no alignment between what the majority of the American people want in domestic or foreign policy and what their representatives are doing. But that is not a problem of the Republicans, the Democrats, the Bidens, or the Trumps. That's across the government. And the attacks on dissent, the attacks on students, the attacks on faculty, the attacks on university did not start with Trump. They started with President Biden. And the same members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans in the Congress. I do believe that we are heading toward in a very fascistic direction with this government. There's no doubt in my mind. Having been someone who worked on authoritarian regimes all around the world, that's what is being constructed right here as we speak. But that wasn't created by Trump. The kindling for that has been laid for 45 or 50 years, successively by Democrats and Republicans, and Trump is just the fascist clown to light that kindling ablaze, and that's what he's doing. And that is as true of domestic policy as it is of foreign policy, including what's happening in Israel and Palestine. So Trump is terrible. Biden was terrible. I mean, people would say, okay, there's the genocide, but, it's like that old thing, okay, Mrs. Lincoln, but other than that, how was the theater, right? Like we're supposed to forgive the perpetration of a genocide. And if genocide is not a red line, what is the red line? What could possibly be worse than that? Of course, we're getting more genocide from Donald Trump, but that's a statement of the corruption of the system and the fact that there is no moral choice presented by the two parties and that we have to look for alternatives. And that's why, and I'll finish with this, the difference is not going to be made by the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Congress of the United States. It's only going to be made by people, by movements, by civil society, by labor unions, by churches and synagogues and mosques, by the people in this room. And I'll repeat what I said the other day, the hour is late. So anyone who isn't mobilized needs to get mobilized now.
When Trump came in, or was coming in, and established the ceasefire, there were some people who were kind of like, look, Trump is the one who's established the ceasefire. And It's true, that is what he did, and that Biden was never willing to do. And my understanding is that the reason Netanyahu unwillingly went along with that was because Trump threatened the weapons sales. And obviously, once he sort of achieved the theater of having the ceasefire for his inauguration, I don't think he was terribly concerned with how long it lasted after that. Clearly, it was few people anticipated it was ever going to go to phase 2. And I think for me, in terms of reflecting on Biden versus Trump, everything Craig said, absolutely. I mean, things like Biden implementing the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliances, or the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, into federal guidelines, which includes the notion that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. And now Trump is most likely going to sign a bill criminalizing any critique of Israel into anti-discrimination laws. And so I think initially there was a little bit of a sense of like, okay, Biden clearly was in favor of the genocide and funded it to the tune of $17.9 billion. Is Trump, he says he wants a Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe for everything else that I'm terrified of him coming back into power, maybe he'll actually be a president who will stand up to someone like Netanyahu. So before joining State, working at Quincy, I was focusing a lot of my attention on Yemen and the fact that under Obama and then Trump, the United States was providing assistance, initially refueling, intelligence to the Saudi-led coalition engaging in these horrific attacks on Yemen and what was at the time the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the UN. And so seeing, obviously, not only Biden launching Operation Prosperity Guardian to go after the Houthis for being one of the groups. And to be clear, the Houthis have benefited politically from sort of the perception of standing up to Israel and the United States. I mean, I want to be clear, the Houthis do a lots of human rights abuses in their own right. But they were one of the only actors to try to stand up and do what they could in the name of defending Palestine. And observing the Biden administration doing this about face, which for years had told the Saudis, you need to stop bombing, facilitating the winding down of U.S. support to the Saudi-led coalition, and then just imagining the schadenfreude of Mohammed bin Salman as Biden is urging him to engage in bombing the Houthis again. And he hasn't, MBS has been unwilling to do so because the Houthis have demonstrated that they could hit him and, impair Vision 2030. And so then seeing Trump, so obviously the Houthis had said that they would no longer attack ships as long as the ceasefire was in place. Israel obviously not letting in humanitarian aid starting on March 2nd. The Houthis declared on March 11th that they were going to restart attacks on ships. They had not yet done so when Trump's administration, in that notorious signal thread, decided on March 15th that they were going to start bombing the Houthis again. And subsequently, we've seen horrific attacks on civilian infrastructure, parts of Yemen that previously the United States had told the Saudis and the Emiratis, you need to be careful not to hit some of these sites. All that to say, it's so clear that initially Trump seemed to show some kind of willingness to stand up to Netanyahu, and that has evaporated such that he is willing to go after something, there's very little U.S. shipping that goes through the Red Sea. I mean, from sort of like an America First, MAGA perspective, it's not all that America First to be defending the ships that go through because, it's not U.S. ships that tend to go through that waterway. Or the shipping companies are actually enjoying the increased profits they get from having to go around the Horn of Africa. And so just seeing and you know, I don't know necessarily what was it that changed for Trump. I mean, was it Miriam Adelson, who obviously has spent hundreds of millions of dollars for Trump's various campaigns? But what was it exactly? Like, why was Trump willing to stand up to Netanyahu then, and clearly doesn't seem to be willing to do so anymore? Is so devastating given the level of what we're seeing now in Gaza. And I do think in terms of, well, what's going on right now, I think this is the final stage. I think at the same time that this issue of Palestine has never been more salient for Americans, you know, historically it was just not really something that people were necessarily that engaged in. A French journalist told me she was really impressed because historically in France, this is something that sort of the left has been more motivated around the issue of Palestine, and she'd never seen Americans be all that involved. And now she's like, the Americans are paying so much more attention even than the French people. But my fear is that by the time we see kind of the generational shift and the demographic shift on the issue of Palestine, such that it's no longer possible for members of Congress to continue to send weapons to commit genocide, I don't know who's going to be left alive in Palestine. So that's where I think we are.
The genocide could not have occurred, and it could not have continued without the support of the United States government with money and weapons and intelligence and diplomatic cover and the veto and so on. And US support could not have been sustained without media complicity. And virtually every media corporation in the United States and several across the West have been openly complicit. Some to the extent that I have raised the issue of Der Stürmer in the Nuremberg tribunals after the genocide of European Jews in the Holocaust, and then in the Rwanda tribunal, Radio Mille Collines, which also, both of whom were found guilty of incitement and complicity in genocide, and were sentenced for those crimes. And some of the Western media corporations have crossed the line between just propagandistic reporting and have crossed over into incitement and complicity. And I've said that it's not just that they're saying, I mean, I don't have to tell anyone in this room, I suppose you all have access to the media, whether it's Fox or MSNBC or CNN or ABC, NBC, CBS, Washington Post, Washington Times, Wall Street Journal. It's pretty much across the board that those corporations have aligned themselves with the genocide and with the Israeli project. And they've done it in horrible ways. They've done it by disseminating false genocide propaganda on behalf of the Israelis in order to create space for genocide. So we've all heard the 40 beheaded babies, all of the other lies that were disseminated to create space for genocide and to build support for the genocide against the Palestinians. They do it by a blackout of information that clearly shows that there is a genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity underway. They do it by justifying war crimes. So when the Israelis blow up a hospital and they say, oh, there was Hamas inside that hospital, it's parroted by these media corporations as well, providing justification for war crimes, and across the board on this, hiding the horrific reality of that. Now, for some people, maybe there's an excuse in that. I didn't know. But I gotta believe almost a year and a half into this thing, where you have independent media that's telling the truth, which is available to everybody, where you have social media, where it is literally, as the saying goes, being live streamed. You can see the images. You can see the reality of what's happening. It's hard for anyone in this country to now claim ignorance. So I think media has to be held accountable, but media has to be held accountable in a way that does not undercut free speech or press freedom, because I promise you that any rollbacks on free speech or press freedom won't be used against them, it'll be used against us, right? So we have to jealously protect those things, even as we seek to hold these corporations accountable. The Arab governments have been absolutely atrocious, and it's exactly what I expected. Because if you have followed the region over the long term, you will see that every government in the region that dared to stand up to the US-Israeli project for the Middle East was either corrupted and compromised, that is to say, bought out. These are autocratic leaders. They don't give a damn about democracy. They know where their bread is buttered. Or if they won't go along, they were completely crushed. So that's Syria and Libya and half of Lebanon. I say half of Lebanon because there still is a resistance in Lebanon, and Egypt and Jordan long ago were bought out by the Americans and the Brits, and so you have them all making strong rhetorical statements about the horrors that are being perpetrated, but not only are they not doing a damn thing to stop it, and not only are they in breach of their international law obligations to ensure respect for humanitarian law, to prevent genocide, to intervene in any way that they can, but they've been collaborating with the Americans and the Israelis on Israel's exercise. These are not legitimate governments. And I agree with Annelle that one of the few governments, although Yemen is divided between two governments, who have actually taken action. And what you will never read in the corporate media here is why Yemen is blocking ships going into the Red Sea, destined for the Red Sea port of Israel, of Eilat, which they successfully bankrupted. The port of Eilat was bankrupted, obstructing the resupplying of the Israeli regime for its genocide. That's not just an act of creativity. It's what the World Court has said you're supposed to do. Right? And I do not share the view of the world of the Houthis. I do not share the politics of the Houthis. They are a conservative, tribal, sectarian body that doesn't have a good human rights record. But it just so happens that here they're doing the right thing and they're being bombed for it. And when I say they, I mean the people of Yemen, the many civilians who have been made to pay the cost. Other than Yemen, I can't name an Arab government that has done what it's supposed to do under international law to try to intercede in this. And the other one who deserves all praise is the government of South Africa. South Africa, another country that has experienced apartheid, just as the Palestinians are experiencing apartheid, has stood up at considerable cost, economic and diplomatic, and stood against the great powers in the world because of this strong sense of solidarity and justice, and they have taken Israel to court, and they have changed the world. From 1948 until that court case was brought, Israel had enjoyed absolute impunity, absolute unbroken wall of impunity. That wall got a very significant crack when South Africa found the courage to do what they did, and we're all a part of that project now.
In terms of the complicity of the media, I do think that heritage media is facilitating its own decline. When you think about the efforts to also try to make TikTok no longer available as a result of its role in spreading awareness of the genocide of Palestinians. Obviously, in a country that is deeply polarized, where people have a lot of feelings of nostalgia for an era when everybody got their information from a couple of very similar sources, I do recognize people's concern of what comes about for a society that does have such dichotomous views of the world and is not understanding, sort of doesn't have a sense of a shared reality. But at the same time, I do have hope for what will come out of this, of new sources of information and the need for what would replace the sort of the complicity in genocide and as Craig said so eloquently, the incitement to genocide that we've witnessed. And in that line, thinking about, I was in conversation with a human rights lawyer and was speaking with her about just sort of how depressing it was seeing the absolute abnegation of international law and international humanitarian law. And she actually said that she felt somewhat, not optimistic, but just the fact that so many people are talking about international law and international humanitarian law and know what is the International Court of Justice, what is the International Criminal Court, in ways that previously these weren't necessarily so front of mind for people, and that it has really demonstrated so clearly, which what was obvious prior to this, but I think many more people are much more cognizant of the need for new institutions and new systems, for a UN where if the vast majority of countries vote to rein in the actions of a rogue state, that you can't have a superpower vote to prevent that accountability. At the same time, recognizing that the UN itself was set up to try to prevent another world war. And part of the reason the great powers were allowed to have a veto was to keep them engaged in this system such that they could continue to do what they wished to do rather than go back to great power war. And there is a tension there, but at the same time, the UN was set up at a time where colonialism remained very much in charge of the world. And so I think at this point, so many decades on from that, I do believe that it is possible to rethink these institutions in ways that do provide for justice and, inshallah, will continue to help prevent great power war moving forward.
We are in a crisis of international law right now. It's just as Americans sense that all of the institutions of democracy and so on, for what they've been worth lately, are being dismantled. It is also true that the entire international system is being challenged right now, all on behalf of one small oppressive foreign regime in the Middle East. The normal thing is that, because we know now what the law is, the Genocide Treaty is clear, the Fourth Geneva Convention is clear, the International Human Rights Treaties are clear, the Rome Statute is clear. It's all laid out very clearly. Everybody knows, and the International Court of Justice has ruled that these things apply and that they're being violated, and it's issued provisional measures, and it said that there's a duty on all states, all 193 states, to take particular action. And the US has used its veto in the Security Council, the only enforcement mechanism, to block the Security Council. So what has happened then? It's gone to the General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace Emergency Special Session. This is all technical, but basically all the countries of the world in the General Assembly where there is no veto came together and they said, yes, this must happen. And now they are all under attack by the US, the UK, Germany, and others that are aligned with the Israeli, with the Israeli regime. Is international law going to survive? Maybe not. Because if you can get away with a live stream genocide, that means genocide is no longer unlawful. And everybody is taking notes around the world that now genocide is okay. And so it is with all of the other crimes that have been documented here. So what happens when institutions, formal institutions, either in our government or in international institutions fail? Then it becomes our job. And I witnessed, like many of the people in this room, I think, what happened with South Africa and the fact that South Africa under apartheid was supported by the government of the United States and most Western governments straight through the 1980s. And people who demonstrated and criticized against it were accused of being supporters of terrorism, and being communist, which in those days was considered a bad word. It depends on where you are. But were smeared and slandered and attacked and so on. And yet, the movement continued to grow through boycott, divestment, sanctions, education, demonstration, civil disobedience. All of that forced the governments of the West to stop supporting the apartheid regime, just as it's our job to force the governments of the West to stop supporting this regime, to isolate the regime and to demand the change that we are demanding for human rights. So yeah, it's up to us, because these institutions, they move slowly, if at all, and they're very compromised. And by the way, they're very much under attack by Israeli and American intelligence services that are threatening judges and prosecutors and others to not do the right thing, and that's why things are stalling now, in spite of the very historic moves by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice.
To the first question, would Israel behave differently if Hamas were to give up power? I really don't think so. I mean, in terms of, before the emergence of Hamas, you had Israel portraying the PLO as communist, as obviously that being such a bad word at the time. Again, I do think that there may have been a time in the past when there may have been a little bit more of a sense that, well, if we don't have the excuse of going after Hamas, it's going to be harder. But I think at this point, it's just demonstrated that they can do whatever they want, and clearly it's not about Hamas. And you have a government in Israel that is set on expansionism and thinks that whether it was under Biden or if Harris had won, or now under Trump, that they can do whatever they want. So I in no way think that if Hamas were actually to give up power that we would, or to leave, that we'd see Israel behaving any differently. As a society, I think we're becoming somewhat inured to this notion that we live in unprecedented times. And so I think for many people, hearing expressions of, we've never seen this many journalists killed in such a short time in a single, in any conflict, since they started keeping records. We've never seen this kind of targeting of aid workers, of doctors, this many children killed. And I do think that sometimes people we're just a little bit accustomed to this. Sometimes there isn't necessarily the context there of, going back to other conflicts where certainly there were atrocities, but aid workers were protected, or there was at least some recognition of everyone benefits from the protection of certain protected sites, et cetera. Just, the laws, international humanitarian law. There's a reason we agreed to these after World War II. And the notion that Netanyahu would say, well, the United States bombed, the carpet bombing of Japan, or the atomic bomb, the atomic bomb in Japan, and the horrific bombing of Germany, and not acknowledging that, well, right after that, we established the Fourth Geneva Convention, and we established all of these efforts to try to prevent that from happening, in recognition that as a species, we should no longer do that to ourselves. The figures now, that's a great question, and I don't know if Greg has better information. I mean, other than, we know that Bernie Sanders tried unsuccessfully to have the JRD yesterday and got even fewer votes than the last time he tried, which itself was historic in him introducing a JRD against Israel. But I'm sure there are people keeping track of those numbers, but I don't have them right now.
I've been involved long enough to remember when Hamas didn't even exist, and the attacks they didn't exist until the 1980s, well into the 80s, and the attacks on Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem were ongoing then, as well as they were going all the way back before the creation of the State of Israel. Hamas has offered over and over again to give up power as in terms of governing of the Gaza Strip. That has had no impact on the position of Israel, which prefers not to negotiate a solution, but to implement the solution that they've chosen. It's not about Hamas. It's never been about Hamas, and there are so many indicators of this. The first and foremost being that almost 3/4 of the casualties in Gaza are women and children. And don't forget that most of the men are also not combatants who have been killed, in case anyone thinks men don't matter. So clearly this is not a war with Hamas. This is an annihilatory campaign. This is genocide. I mean, every aspect of the situation makes that clear over and over again. It's true that Israel has broken the world record for the murder of humanitarian workers, and it has broken the world record for the murder of UN workers. Hundreds of UN workers alone have been murdered during this campaign, many along with their families. As a part of because they are very important because they stand between annihilation and survival. They are the biggest humanitarian presence in the country. But it's not only them, it's also international aid workers that have been targeted and murdered by Israel in numbers we have never seen in the history of the modern history, the history of the UN. Just the other day, 14 humanitarian first responders were pulled over, lined up against a wall, put their hands in cuffs, and were executed one by one, buried in a mass grave along with their vehicles by the Israeli occupation forces. and they just happen to have been discovered by the UN and others, and identified. By the way, I'm not sure that you would even see that, any details of these kinds of things on the corporate media in the United States. So it's true that the idea of the safety of humanitarian workers has been erased altogether in Gaza. On the resolution in the Security Council on child rights that was mentioned as well, those meetings benefit from a report of the Special Advisor on Children in Armed Conflict. I don't know if you remember this, right? And they have been politically compromised by successive secretaries general of the UN under pressure from the Israelis and the Americans, where the humanitarian workers and the human rights part of the UN every year submit evidence of Israel being in violation of the rights of children in armed conflict, all of the atrocities that have been committed. And year after year, they have struck Israel's name from the list before it goes to the Security Council, so as not to irritate the Americans and the Brits and the Israel lobby and so on. Last year, when Israel broke the record for the murder of children, they were forced to include Israel in the annex that goes to the Security Council because it was just unsustainable. The cover-up had become unsustainable. And that is, it's difficult to celebrate that they're finally doing the right thing, because what compelled them to do the right thing is a record-breaking murder of children. I used to protest on campus in the 1980s, but nobody cared. And when I see the pushback that students are getting and the fact that they're standing up anyway, I am more ready to follow than I am to lead in that regard. And the creativity, I mean, such an admirer of watching JVP take over Grand Central Station, watching JVP take over the Statue of Liberty, and then the student encampments that took just courage and, that have been so miserably and falsely smeared over and over again. That they are really the leaders. How do we resist and protest this? And I say by any way that we can. I mean, we have to make sure that the noise that we are making is louder than the pressure that's coming from the other side. And that means this is not a normal moment in history. This is not a moment to sort of go along and write op-eds. This is a moment to really, I believe in civil disobedience, but I think that people have to do a personal assessment. Like for example, I believe those of us who have more privilege have to step up to protect those who are more vulnerable. So if you're on a student visa, and I would never discourage anybody from taking whatever righteous action they think is right, but those on a student visa or on a green card, maybe those of us who have citizenship need to step in and so on. And so solidarity is the biggest tool that we have to stand up against this when the institutions themselves are a part of the problem. I wake up every day in a country that is perpetrating genocide and that is persecuting people who are speaking out against that genocide. Every day I wake up in that place, And so I can't write to my congressman or woman about this. I have to fight my congressmen and women about this. Boycott, divest, sanction, protest, demonstrate, civil disobedience. When they tell us to quiet down, we need to make more noise, because the entire campaign against the movement is a campaign of fear. And they want to make a few, and believe me, if they get away with punishing the speech of people on green cards or student visas, and then they use their magic word defense, you are an anti-Semite, you are a supporter of terrorism, you need to be absolutely clear that citizens are next. You are not protected by your passport. They're going to use the same things because they're criminalizing the defense of human rights. That's the regime under which we are living now. And so it's not business as usual. We have to really push back at every possible level. The one thing I would say is don't give up on the institutions that are still accessible to us. So I haven't given up on the UN, especially the human rights rapporteurs and the treaty bodies and those institutions that are human rights based, that can help to amplify the voice of the movement, that can help to bestow some public legitimacy, that we get those kinds of resolutions. Same thing for the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Deeply flawed institutions, but they're still accessible to us. And they've pried open a space that we can use to amplify the righteous calls of people involved in this movement and in the broader human rights movement in general, defending migrants here in this country, defending people living in poverty, defending people who are members of groups that are persecuted or marginalized or vulnerable. These are tools that we can use. And they were used by the South Africans, and they were used in the anti-colonial struggles of Africa and Asia and Latin America, and we can use them as well, I think.
I absolutely agree with everything Craig said, but I also understand the fear, again, that we are living at a time when it does feel frightening. And so again, I just want to commend, I think the first thing to do is this, coming together in community, building these connections, and in particular, reaching out to others who maybe you wouldn't have thought this is something that they also, have to wake up every morning feeling haunted by this. Because I do think so many people are so deeply affected by this. And as someone kind of a little bit to your question of what was the pushback, or have you gotten much attack? I was anticipating much more attack than I got, and in many ways, what I experienced was people thanking me, and certainly there were some. And what was interesting was sometimes it was Democrats saying, "Well, you're just like a secret Trump operative, aren't you? Like you're trying to make the Dems look bad." And certainly there were those, charges of anti-Semitic, like that's a frequent card they like to play. But for the most part, I do think that many people are haunted by what's happening and maybe looking for a way in. And so recognizing that absolutely demonstrating, protesting, getting loud, but also conversations with people who maybe wouldn't have necessarily thought that this was something that they might care about, bringing this up just in ordinary conversation, just, that, Derek was saying, just the and I'm probably going to start crying talking about this, but just the sense of having to go through one's life and we all have to, make our lunch and take care of our kids, like keep earning our salaries, like we have to continue to exist in a capitalist system, but recognizing that so many other people are also going through, and that to bring this up, I do think that there's a lot of untapped power here that is a powerful antidote to the fear that this administration is very successfully cultivating. As far, what to say to young people who are trying to make decisions about, do I go to law school? Do I try and enter the bureaucracy? This is a question I've gotten a lot. And what I try to say to people is follow your strengths, do what you find meaningful to you. Like, what are you going to want to do day after day? Like, are you someone who really, going out and demonstrating is kind of like your path? Well, I think everyone should do that in addition to what else they do. But recognizing that it is at the end of the day a choice about what are you going to do with your life, and recognizing both that these institutions are deeply flawed, but they are also all that we have, and also recognizing people inside the State Department who were trying within the system to do what they could. And so the question about the Leahy laws, there's been excellent reporting from Brett Murphy at ProPublica on this, who broke the story of the fact that the determination that Israel had violated Leahy laws before October 7th had been on Secretary Blinken's desk since December of 2023, again, not in relation to post-October 7th, and that he had simply done nothing with it. Knowing that, I think there wasn't going to be, even to make a determination that Israel was in violation of the Leahy laws, the United States was not going to cut off weapons to any of the units engaged in gross human rights violations. And so inside the State Department, there's something called the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum, which is Israel is the only country that sort of has this internal deliberative process to ask, well, are we actually going to impose Leahy on them? And always in the past, the decision was like, no, we're not going to. And so the fact that they finally made the decision that, yes, we are going to make this determination, and then Blinken just refused to move forward with it. But this is what I observed inside state, where it's very difficult to be one person trying to make a difference when you have sort of an army of other people who sort of know the way things are supposed to go. So for example, if I tried to like change the language in a document about Israel or to point out a human rights abuse, someone would just come in after me and change it again. And if I wanted to escalate that to my boss to say, no, we do need to say this, my boss might back me up as the the director of the Human Rights Office, but his boss probably wasn't going to back up that decision. So I may be undermining the notion that it's still worth it to try to make your way into some of these institutions. But I do think I do think on this issue there is a change coming. And I also just, speaking to the fact that someone like Donald Trump successfully was able to play into the fact that Americans are so tired of endless wars and militarism that, was successfully portrayed himself as the peace candidate against Hillary Clinton and similarly against Biden and Harris. And knowing that, this poll that came out from the Institute for Middle East Understanding and YouGov, that it was, see if I can get it, that it was 29% of people who had voted for Biden and didn't vote for Harris who cited Gaza as their issue, and that was more than immigration concerns or inflation concerns. And so that really the Dems lost on genocide, on Gaza. I think that says a lot. And so for all that these institutions are so deeply flawed, I certainly hope that there are people who are planning to run on these issues. And I know people like Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman are trying to kind of provide information about, like, how do you combat what happened to them for others in Congress. I mean, as far as the question of, like, what you came here for more hope, or, like, what do we do now? Who to turn to? I don't know that I have much more to offer beyond just that I do think that this has demonstrated kind of a global appetite that the systems have to change. These institutions don't serve us anymore. And, I hope that in the process of hopefully remaking them, we are, and that all of us, that it will take, as Craig was saying, in terms of thinking about the case of South Africa, that it requires people standing up for other people.
Let's give a round of applause for our amazing speakers.